Imagine a silence. Not just the absence of sound, but a silence like a physical pressure, like cotton stuffing the world to the very edges of the universe. A silence that followed a deafening roar so all-consuming that it ceased to be sound and became pure vibration, shaking the very essence of matter. August 9th, 1945. 3 days had passed, or 4. Time, here in this thick darkness that smelled of dust, old wood, and fear, had ceased to exist in the usual sense. It was measured not in hours, but in sips of warm, stagnant water, in grains of raw rice that had to be chewed for an eternity to deceive the emptiness in the stomach, and in the heartbeats counting down the seconds to madness. At the center of this timelessness, in the heart of a stone prison, sat 4 people. The old man, Kenji, resembled a dried tree root. His eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, looked not at those around him, but through them, into a past or a future, known only to him. His son Takeshi, a 35-year-old man whose face had expressed stubbornness and annoyance just 3 days ago, was now a mask of confusion and terror. His strong hands, accustomed to hauling sacks of rice, lay limp on his knees. Beside him, trying to be invisible, sat his wife Akiko, cradling their 6-year-old daughter, Hana. The girl wasn't crying. She had forgotten how. Her large, dark eyes simply stared into the darkness, trying to understand why the sun no longer rose. They were the last people on Earth. At least, it felt that way. Not a sound came from outside. No barking dogs, no creaking carts, no neighbors' voices, not even the distant drone of planes that had become the familiar soundtrack to the war. It had all been erased. All that remained was this box of earth, wood, and stone, their family's shame, their curse, which had become the only ark in a fiery deluge. The old man Kenji, the keeper of this ark, stirred. Everyone flinched. In their microcosm, any movement was an event. He didn't say a word. He simply extended a bony hand and dragged a finger across the inner wall of the storehouse, leaving another scratch. The 4th. Or was it the 5th? Takeshi couldn't count. He looked at his father, and in his gaze, fear, hatred, and gratitude mingled. A monstrous, unbearable gratitude to the man whose madness had saved them. But to understand how a proud family of rice merchants had turned into a primitive tribe locked in a man-made cave, how their home, the object of the whole street's ridicule, had become the last bastion of life in a dead city, we must go back, just a few days, to the morning of August 6th when the sun still shone, the world still had a voice, and shame was just shame, not salvation. August 6th, 1945. The morning in Hiroshima was humid and stifling, like a wet towel thrown over one's face. The air, thick and still, hummed with a chorus of cicadas, their incessant chirping burrowing under the skin, becoming a part of consciousness, a part of this languid, exhausting summer in the final year of the war. The Tanaka family had been up for hours. The days when they could afford the luxury of a slow morning were long gone, along with the shipments of the best rice from Niigata Prefecture and the respect of their neighbors. Takeshi, the head of the family, at least formally, stood in the middle of the yard and stared at it. At this monster, this ugly spawn of his father's fear, which occupied the best part of their small plot of land. The Cura, the storehouse. But it wasn't just a storage space like every other merchant had. It was a monolith, a fortress, a citadel built not to store rice, but to wage war against the earth itself. His grandfather, Kenji, who in his youth had survived the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, had returned from it a different man. He had seen Tokyo and Yokohama turn to ash and ruin, had seen the earth split open underfoot, had seen wooden houses, the pride of Japanese carpenters, fold like cards, burying thousands of souls. And that terror, once witnessed, had taken root in him forever. Upon returning to Hiroshima, he sold almost everything they owned and invested every coin into the construction of this monster. The neighbors tapped their temples. Why would a rice merchant need a storehouse with walls a meter, over 3 feet, thick, with a foundation that went as deep as an imperial palace's. Why did he need these massive iron-strapped beams of the rarest wood capable of bearing the weight of a mountain? Why this multi-layered tile roof and a door that 2 men could barely budge? Kenji-san has gone mad, they whispered. He fears an earthquake in Hiroshima, where they never happen. Takeshi grew up with these taunts. He hated this Kura with all his soul. It was a monument to their poverty. Because of it, he couldn't get a good education. Because of it, his wife Akiko wore a patched kimono. Because of it, their daughter Hana had so few toys. The Kura had devoured their future, their dignity, their place in society. And on this morning, his patience had run out. "Father!" he shouted, turning to the old man who sat on the veranda, methodically cleaning an old hoe. "I can't look at it anymore. Mr. Yamada asked again yesterday if we would sell him this plot. He wants to build a proper house here, with a garden for the children. And we live in the shadow of this prison." Kenji didn't even raise his head. His hands continued to move with unhurried precision. "Mr. Yamada is a fool," he rasped, not looking at his son. "His house is made of paper and sticks. He thinks of gardens when steel birds that carry fire fly in the sky. The war will be over soon." Desperation rang in Takeshi's voice. "Everyone says so. The Emperor will find a way, and we will be left with this stone idol that nobody wants. You have condemned us to a lifetime of shame, all for your fear, which is over 20 years old." At that moment, Akiko came out of the house. She always appeared during their arguments, quiet as a shadow trying to smooth the sharp edges. "Takeshi-san, you shouldn't," she said softly. "Father." But Takeshi wasn't listening. He walked right up to the old man. "I will tear it down," he hissed. "I swear, as soon as the war is over, I will dismantle this monument to your madness, stone by stone. We will build a house here. A normal house. Do you hear me?" Kenji slowly, very slowly, raised his eyes to him. In their depths, there was no anger, no resentment, only an endless, cosmic weariness and something else, something akin to pity. "You understand nothing," he said, so quietly his words were almost lost in the cicada's drone. "You haven't seen the earth tremble. You don't know what real fear is. You fear the laughter of neighbors. I fear what may come from the sky or from beneath the ground. This house is not a shame. It is..." He didn't finish. At that very instant, at 8:15 in the morning, the world ceased to exist. There was no whistle, no howl, no roar of approaching death that they had grown accustomed to over months of air raids. Nothing. Just light. Not sunlight, not earthly light. A light brighter than 1,000 suns. An absolute searing light that seeped through eyelids, through the bones of the skull, striking the brain directly. It was a blindness that could be seen. Takeshi instinctively squeezed his eyes shut and threw his hands up to cover his face, but the light was already inside him. And then came the pressure. A silent, monstrous wave that compressed the air, forcing it from his lungs. He felt as if his body would burst from within, like an overripe fruit. He wanted to scream but couldn't make a sound, for there was no more air in the world to scream with. And following the silent pressure came the sound. Or rather, not a sound, but its physical embodiment. A cataclysm that didn't just strike the ears. It entered the body, every cell, making bones vibrate and teeth crumble. The entire world, it seemed, had turned into one endless, low, gut-wrenching roar. The ground beneath Takeshi's feet heaved, not like an earthquake, in jolts and shudders, but in a single, powerful, unceasing spasm. He was thrown forward onto the veranda at his father's feet. He saw Akiko, who had let out a thin, mouse-like squeak, clutch little Hana, and he saw old Kenji, showing neither surprise nor fear, grab them both with one arm and cling to a massive veranda post with the other. And in that moment, Takeshi watched the world outside begin to disappear. Mr. Yamada's paper house, the one with the garden for the children, simply vanished. It didn't catch fire, it didn't collapse. It popped like a soap bubble, disintegrating into millions of splinters. The roofs of neighboring houses flew into the air like leaves tossed by a child's hand and crumbled into dust. Trees ignited like matches and instantly became black skeletons. Everything that made up his street, his neighborhood, his city, everything he had known and hated, loved and despised, it was all turning into a chaos of fire, dust, and flying debris in a single instant. His world was dying before his eyes. And the only thing not moving in this apocalyptic dance of death was their house. No, not the house. The kura. His father's monstrous, ugly, shameful storehouse. The building shuddered. The heavy beams under the roof groaned like mythical beasts. Tiles rained down like hail. But the walls stood. They stood like a cliff in a raging ocean. Kenji, without a word, dragged Akiko and Hana toward the massive storehouse door. "In here! Quickly!" His voice was hoarse but firm as steel. Takeshi, deafened, blinded, uncomprehending, crawled after them on all fours. The air grew hot, scalding his face and lungs. The sky, blue a second ago, had turned a crimson black. With a superhuman effort, the old man threw his weight against the enormous wooden door, and with a screech that drowned out even the roar of the dying world, it began to yield. "Inside!" he bellowed. Takeshi tumbled into the saving darkness of the storehouse, followed by Akiko with the child. Kenji was the last to enter. He cast a glance at what was once Hiroshima, and for a split second, Takeshi saw in his eyes not triumph, but only an immeasurable, universal sorrow. Then the old man leaned with all his weight on the door from the inside. A huge wooden bolt, as thick as a grown man's arm, slid into its slot with a thud. And in the ensuing darkness and relative quiet, broken only by the rumble outside and their own ragged breathing, Takeshi understood. He understood everything. His father was not a madman. He was a prophet, and they had just locked themselves inside his ark while the rest of the world drowned in fire. The first few minutes, or perhaps hours, were spent in a state bordering on suspended animation. Time had compressed into a dense, viscous ball of pure terror. They sat on the cold earthen floor in complete, absolute darkness, unable to move or speak a word. The only sound was their own breathing, ragged, convulsive, like that of cornered animals. A ceaseless rumble came from outside, a deep and low drone, as if the entire world had turned into a giant furnace. The storehouse walls, thick as a fortress's, vibrated minutely, transmitting the convulsions of the dying earth to their bodies. The air was thick with the smell of dust, dry clay, and something else, acrid and unfamiliar, seeping through invisible cracks. Takeshi was the first to come to his senses. The shock began to recede, giving way to a cold, clammy panic. They were trapped, buried alive. The thought struck him like a physical blow. "We have to get out!" His voice broke into a hoarse whisper that seemed deafening in the silence. "The door! We have to open the door!" He scrambled to his feet, stumbling in the dark, and felt his way to the massive wooden bolt. He pulled it once, twice. It wouldn't budge. Something outside had obviously collapsed, blocking the exit. "Help me!" he screamed, and his cry was hopelessly swallowed by the thick walls. He began to beat his fists against the thick planks, bloodying his knuckles, but the only response was a dull, hopeless thud. It was like trying to punch through a mountain. "We're going to die here," Akiko whispered, and her voice held such despair that little Hana, who had been silent until then, began to sob quietly. And then, another sound came from the darkness. A sharp scratching sound, a strike, and a tiny flame flickered to life. It was Kenji lighting a match. In its trembling light, their faces looked like deathly pale masks. The old man's eyes were calm. There wasn't a shadow of panic in them. "Stop," he told Takeshi. His voice was steady and firm, and this firmness had a sobering effect on everyone. The door is blocked. And even if it weren't, opening it now would be suicide. It is hell outside. The match burned down, searing his fingers, and darkness fell again. But this darkness no longer held the same panic. It held something new. The old man's will. He had become the center of their tiny, dying universe. "Everything we need is here," he continued, his voice guiding them like a thread through the dark. They heard him moving around the storehouse. The shuffling steps, a creak, the scratch of a match again. And this time, it lit the wick of an old kerosene lamp. A dim, yellow light snatched a small space from the gloom. And Takeshi saw what he had never noticed before. Along the walls were not only sacks of rice. There were neatly arranged barrels sealed with wax, various crates, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. This wasn't just a storehouse. It was a Noah's Ark, meticulously prepared for the flood. "Water!" Kenji knocked on one of the barrels. The sound was full, reassuring. "Rainwater. I've been collecting it for 20 years, filtered through sand and charcoal. It will last a long time if we drink sparingly." He moved to another wall. "Rice, not the kind for sale. This is in special clay pots, sealed with wax. It can last forever." He opened one of the pots. Inside were perfect white grains, smelling of dryness and time. There are dried vegetables, salted fish, even a little sugar. He spoke, and Takeshi stared at him, unable to believe it. His whole life, he had seen his father as nothing more than a stubborn, senile old man, obsessed with ghosts of the past. Now he saw a strategist, a survival genius who had spent decades preparing for this very day. A day that no one but him had believed in. Power in their small family and their tiny state of 4 had at that moment passed from him, Takeshi, to the father he despised. The old man he had wanted to curse that morning had become their only hope. Kenji took 4 clay cups and a dipper from a crate. He filled them with water from the barrel. "Drink," he said, slowly. "We must get used to it." Takeshi took the cup. The water was cool, with an earthy taste, but it was the most delicious water he had ever had in his life. He looked at his father over the rim of the cup, and for the first time in years, Kenji met his gaze. There was no reproach or triumph in the old man's eyes, only a heavy, leaden knowledge. He had been right. And being right was more terrible than any curse. The kerosene lamp became their sun. Its dim, flickering flame cast bizarre dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the familiar space of the storehouse into a mysterious cave full of spirits. This small source of light and warmth became the center of their new world, their campfire, around which the primitive tribe of the Tanaka family gathered. This first victory over chaos, over darkness and the unknown, breathed a fragile, barely glowing hope into them. Kenji, their new, undisputed leader, acted without fuss, with the methodicalness of a man who had rehearsed this role his entire life. He didn't just get out supplies, he began to create a system. "We will only burn the lamp in the evening," he declared as his first law. "Kerosene is scarce. During the day, we will get used to the dark." He found old but clean straw mats in a corner and spread them on the earthen floor. "This will be our sleeping place." He designated another corner for their needs, dragging an old bucket there and sprinkling the floor with a layer of ash from a sack he had, it turned out, also stored. "Smells are our enemy here. Cover with fresh ash after each use." He spoke, and his simple, practical words built order out of chaos. Takeshi and Akiko listened to him in silence, like children listening to a strict but fair father. The morning's rebellion, his angry words about the monument to madness, now seemed unreal, something that had happened in another life, to another person. He looked at his hands, which that morning had been ready to tear down these walls, and realized that now these same hands would fortify them, cherish them, protect them. It was Kenji who discovered the greatest treasure of their shelter, its lungs. High up under the ceiling, almost invisible in the gloom, were 2 small openings covered by a clay grate. Ventilation shafts. The old man explained that he had designed them based on the principle of ancient tombs, to create a constant, barely perceptible draft, while preventing rain or dust from entering thanks to a complex system of bends within the wall. Air. They had air. The thought, the realization that they would not suffocate in this sealed box was like a miracle. On his father's orders, Takeshi found some old cloth and rinsed it several times in the precious water. Then, standing on crates, he managed to secure the damp rags over the inner grates. "We will filter what we breathe," Kenji explained. "I don't know what's out there, but the air is poison now." This first joint, meaningful task, creating primitive air filters, united them. They were no longer just frightened victims. They were fighters. Their weapons were not rifles and swords, but the old man's ingenuity and their own obedience. Akiko, recovering from the initial shock, took charge of Hana. She whispered fairy tales to her, played finger games with her, trying to create an illusion of normalcy for the child in this twilight world. She found an old silk scarf, once intended for sale, and made a doll for her daughter. This small, bright doll seemed incredibly alive in the gloom of the storehouse, a symbol of an unbroken spirit. Their first meal was like a sacred ritual. Kenji measured out a handful of dry rice for each of them. "Chew slowly," he instructed, "very slowly, until the rice turns to mush in your mouth. This way, we trick the stomach and get more energy." He gave them each half a cup of water. They ate in complete silence, listening to the sound of their own jaws. And in this silence, in this ritual, there was a beauty of its own. They had conquered hunger. They had conquered thirst. They had conquered suffocation. They were alive. They had created their own small, functioning universe inside a dead world. But their victory did not go unnoticed. When a new sound reached them from outside, through the thick walls, unlike the rumble or the roar, they didn't at first understand what it was. The sound was quiet, rustling, almost gentle, as if someone were sprinkling handfuls of sand on their roof. Kenji raised his head listening, his face turned to stone. "It has begun," he whispered. Takeshi didn't understand. "What has begun, father?" The old man gave him a long, hard look. "The black rain," he said, and in those two words, there was more horror than in the entire roar of the explosion. The system they had built worked. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm, governed by the two main cycles, the rising and setting of the kerosene lamp. By day, gloom, quiet conversation, conservation of energy. By evening, dim light, a meager meal, and again long hours of listening to the silence. They had learned to distinguish its dozens of shades, the booming silence after the explosion, the rustling silence of the black rain, and now a new, most terrible silence, the ringing silence of a dead city. Kenji became their undisputed ruler, their wise but stern emperor. His word was law, his decisions were not debated. He established strict rationing, 1 handful of rice and 2 cups of water per person per day. He made them do simple exercises to prevent muscle atrophy. He started a calendar, scratching the days onto the wall. This was their empire of nothing, their civilization in a single room, and it gave them not only a chance at physical survival, but also a psychological anchor. Order, even one so primitive, was their shield against the madness that reigned outside and tried to seep in. Takeshi accepted the new hierarchy without question. He became his father's right-hand man, his enforcer. He moved crates, checked the filters on the vents, monitored the supplies. The work saved him from his thoughts. But sometimes, in the thick darkness of night, as he lay beside a sleeping Akiko and their daughter, it would wash over him. He would remember his words from that morning, his anger, his hatred for this Kura, and a sense of shame, mixed with a primal terror at the thought of what would have happened if his father had listened to him, would burn him. What had become of Mr. Yamada and his garden? What had become of the other neighbors who had laughed at his father? These thoughts were dangerous. Kenji seemed to sense them from a distance. "Don't think about what's outside," he would say, as if reading his mind. "There is nothing outside anymore. There is only here. Only us." Akiko created her own small world within their larger shelter. Her world was Hana. She dedicated herself completely to protecting the child's fragile psyche from the monstrous truth. She invented a game. They were travelers in a magic cave, waiting for an evil dragon who had stolen the sun to fly away. She told fairy tales she made up on the spot, about brave little mice who lived in the dark and about drops of water that were more precious than gold. She kept life going in the child, and the child, in turn, kept life going in her. They were symbiotes, saving each other from despair. Their small empire seemed stable, almost cozy in its predictability. But it was this very stability that gave birth to the first seed of rebellion. It was, by Kenji's count, the 5th day of their confinement. The supplies were under control, air was coming in, there was no immediate threat to their lives. And it was at this moment, when the existential terror had slightly receded, that Takeshi's former self began to awaken. Not the son, not the enforcer, but the man, the husband, the father, who was used to making his own decisions. He began to doubt. What if rescuers were already searching for survivors? What if it wasn't so dangerous outside anymore? By sitting here in the dark, they might be missing their only chance. This thought, once born, began to grow like a poisonous mushroom. "Father," he began one evening after they had finished their meager meal, "how much longer are we going to sit here? We can't hide forever. We need to try to clear the blockage." Kenji slowly finished chewing his rice grains and looked at him. "It is not yet time," he answered curtly. "When will it be time?" The old rebellious notes returned to Takeshi's voice. "When we start eating each other from hunger, we have to do something." "We are doing something," the old man calmly retorted. "We are surviving. That is what matters now." "This isn't survival, this is being buried alive." Takeshi raised his voice, forgetting Hana was asleep nearby. "You've usurped power, making all the decisions for us. What if you're wrong? What if the same fear that built these walls is now keeping us from leaving them?" Akiko looked at her husband, terrified. It was the first crack in their monolithic unity, the first tremor that threatened to shatter their fragile world. Kenji was silent for a long time, staring at the lamp's flame. Then he said the words that froze the blood in Takeshi's veins. "You want to know what's out there?" he asked quietly. "Fine. Go to the door. And just smell." Takeshi, hurt and angry, walked to the massive door. He pressed his face to the narrow gap between the planks. The smell. A sweetish, nauseating smell. Unlike anything else, a smell he would never forget for the rest of his days. The smell of burnt meat, the smell of decay, the smell of death, thick and tangible. He staggered back from the door, covering his mouth with his hand. He retched. The rebellion was crushed before it had even begun. But while they were dealing with their internal conflict, they didn't hear the first sound of life appear in the dead world outside. A quiet, scraping sound. And then, a faint, barely audible human moan. That sound was more terrifying than the roar of the explosion and more deafening than any silence. At first, it was barely distinguishable, like the squeak of a mouse behind a wall. But gradually it grew clearer. Someone was out there. Alive. The sound shattered the hermetic seal of their ark, seeping inside and poisoning their fragile peace. Takeshi froze, listening. It wasn't just a moan. Now he could make out words. Help. Water. Please. Anyone. The voice was female, hoarse, barely audible, but it belonged to someone Takeshi knew. It was Mrs. Sato, their neighbor, the widow who always treated Hana to rice cakes. The thought that she was out there, just a few meters away, alive, suffering, turned everything inside him upside down. His doubts, his suppressed rebellion, flared up with a new, uncontrollable force. He rushed to the door. "Father, do you hear that? It's Sato-san. She's alive. We have to help her," he shouted, yanking desperately at the massive bolt again. Kenji sat motionless, his face an impenetrable mask. "Do not go near the door," he commanded, but Takeshi was no longer listening. Conscience, guilt, humanity, everything he had so carefully suppressed for the past few days exploded within him. "I will not let her die. We are not animals. We can't just sit here and listen to her die." He scanned the gloom for something heavy, a lever of some kind to move the bolt. His voice was joined by another, then a third. It was their neighbors, the very ones who had laughed at the old man. Now they were begging him for salvation. "Tanaka-san, we know you're in there. Your fortress held. Let us in. I beg you, for the children's sake." Their cries, muffled by the thick walls, blended into a single, multi-voiced wail of suffering. It was a chorus of the dead crying out from the abyss. Akiko covered her ears with her hands and squeezed her eyes shut. Hana woke up and began to cry, frightened by the screams and the desperation in her father's voice. Their entire orderly world was collapsing. Takeshi found a heavy crowbar his father kept for household chores. He ran to the door and had already raised it over the bolt. And in that moment, Kenji stood up. He moved quickly and silently like a ghost. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply stood between Takeshi and the door, blocking his path. In the dim lamplight, his eyes burned with a cold, inhuman fire. "You will not open it," he said. It was not an order. It was a final, unappealable verdict. "Get out of the way, father," Takeshi roared, gripping the crowbar. In that moment, he was ready to strike him. "There are people out there. There is death out there," Kenji cut him off. "They will all die. They are already dead. They just don't know it yet. They have breathed that air. They have drunk that water. Their flesh is already burning from the inside. If you open this door, you will let their death in here. You will kill your wife. You will kill your daughter." The old man's words were as cold and sharp as shards of glass. They pierced Takeshi's consciousness, paralyzing his will. He looked at Akiko, who was staring at him in horror, clutching a crying Hana. He looked at his father, who stood before him like an unshakable rock, the embodiment of a cruel but necessary truth. Kenji took a step forward. "You must choose," he whispered, and his whisper held more power than any scream. "Their lives, or ours. The lives of the doomed, or the life of your daughter. Choose, Takeshi." It was the most terrible choice of his life. On one side, the voices of his neighbors appealing to his conscience. On the other, the silent gaze of his daughter, full of fear and hope. He heard Mrs. Sato's pleas, and her kind face appeared before his eyes. He heard Hana's cries, and his heart tore apart. The crowbar in his hands became unbearably heavy. He lowered it. The metal hit the earthen floor with a thud. Takeshi slowly slid down the wall and covered his face with his hands. He had made his choice. He had chosen his family. He had chosen life. And in that moment, he became an accomplice to the deaths of all those outside. The screams beyond the door continued for a long time, growing weaker, turning into rasps, and then into silence. And that silence was their sentence. The climax of their drama unfolded without a single blow, without a single shot. It was a battle of wills, played out in the gloom to the accompaniment of dying voices. And the victor was a cold, inhuman pragmatism, the only thing that could keep them alive. After Takeshi dropped the crowbar, something inside him broke forever. He no longer argued, no longer doubted, no longer rebelled. He became a shadow, an automaton, unquestioningly carrying out his father's orders. He ate when given food, drank when given water, and sat for hours staring at a single point, listening to a silence that was now filled with unspoken names and soundless screams. Kenji seemed unchanged. He continued to methodically measure portions, tend to the lamp, and scratch days on the wall. But if one looked closely, a faint weariness had appeared in his movements, and in his eyes, when he thought no one was looking, flickered a deep, mortal anguish. He had saved his family, but the price of this victory was terrible. He had killed the man in his son to keep the life in his body. Akiko became the bridge between these two broken men. She cared for Takeshi as if he were sick, silently placing food before him, adjusting his mat. And she also tried to support the old man, handing him the lamp or a cup of water, showing with her silent participation that she understood and did not judge. All her unspent tenderness, all her strength, was now directed at Hana. She played with her even more earnestly, told her even more vivid fairy tales, trying to weave a cocoon of love and fiction around the child to protect her from the poisonous reality of their situation. The days dragged on like thick tar. The 9th, the 10th, the 11th. The cries from outside had long since fallen silent. The world beyond their walls was now absolutely soundless. The smell of decay had faded, replaced by another smell, the scent of cold, damp dust like in a long-abandoned house. One morning, if another awakening in eternal darkness could be called morning, Kenji did not measure out the rice as usual. He went to the door and stood there for a long time, listening. Then he turned to Takeshi. "Help me," he said simply. Together they threw their weight against the massive bolt. It yielded with surprising ease, but the door itself did not open. It was propped shut by something heavy from the outside. They pressed their shoulders against it, once, twice. A scraping and a rustle of falling debris came from outside. The door groaned open a hand's breadth, and a sliver of light pierced the storehouse. Gray, dim, lifeless, but light nonetheless. It struck their darkness-accustomed eyes, forcing them to squint. And with the light came the air. It was not fresh. It smelled of ash, soot, and emptiness. They pushed again, and the door, shoving aside a blockage of charred beams and pieces of tile, opened wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Kenji was the first to step out. Behind him, squinting and staggering like a newborn, emerged Takeshi. Akiko, with Hana in her arms, remained on the threshold of their shelter, hesitant to step into the new world. And they saw it. Words were not enough to describe what met their eyes. It was not a city. It was a desert, an endless field of gray ash, broken bricks, and twisted metal stretching to the horizon. Where houses had stood, now only their foundations remained, like unhealed sores on the body of the earth. Where trees had grown, charred black sticks now jutted out, reaching their dead branches toward a gray sky. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The world had been sterilized, scorched to its very foundations. Directly in front of their kura, where Mr. Yamada's house used to be, a dark silhouette was visible on the ground, the shadow of a person permanently seared into the stone. Further on lay other bodies, or what was left of them, covered in a layer of gray ash, indistinguishable from the other debris. Takeshi lowered his eyes and saw at his feet a small, burnt doll, the very one he had once given to his neighbor's daughter. They had survived. They had emerged from their dark cave into the light. But their salvation was not a return to the world of the living. They had merely stepped from one circle of hell into another, even more terrible one. They stood in the middle of a dead planet, 3 adults and 1 child, the last witnesses to the end of the world. And their home, their ugly, shameful, hated home, stood behind them, the only thing left, indestructible, like a tombstone on the grave of an entire city. The journey through the dead city became their final trial, a test not of the body, but of the soul. They walked through streets that no longer existed, navigating by the bends of rivers and the outlines of distant, miraculously intact hills. Kenji led them, leaning on a staff he had fashioned from a burnt branch. He walked without looking from side to side, as if he knew this road through hell by heart. Takeshi followed, carrying their meager belongings on his back, a small bag of rice and a flask of water. He tried to keep his eyes on his feet to avoid seeing what lay around him, but the images still seeped into his consciousness. Shadows of people burned onto walls, melted husks of streetcars, thousands of shattered bottles that had fused into a glassy mass. Every step on this gray ash was a step on graves. Akiko carried Hana in her arms. She covered the girl's eyes with her sleeve, sang her quiet lullabies to drown out the ringing silence, and constantly whispered in her ear that they were going to a new, beautiful home, where lots of food and toys awaited them. She lied with such desperate conviction that at times, it seemed she herself was beginning to believe it. They encountered other survivors, people with burned skin hanging in tatters, with empty, expressionless eyes. They moved like ghosts, searching for water, for their relatives, for something they could never find again. No one spoke. In this new world, words were unnecessary. The grief was so all-encompassing it had become a form of silence. After several days, they reached the outskirts where the destruction was less total. Soldiers picked them up and took them to a makeshift refugee camp. There, a doctor examined them for the first time. They were fed hot soup and given a clean blanket. The encounter with civilization, with order, with other unbroken people, was a shock to them. Their story of surviving in a sealed storehouse was met with disbelief. You were lucky, people told them, but neither Takeshi nor Kenji felt lucky. They had survived, yes. Physically, they were almost unharmed, unlike the thousands dying from burns and radiation sickness. But their souls had been scorched to ash. They couldn't sleep. At night, Takeshi heard the screams of his neighbors. He saw Mrs. Sato's face pleading for help. He would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as if he were suffocating in the darkness of their storehouse. Kenji barely spoke. He would sit for days on end, staring at a single point, and his silence was heavier than any accusation. He had been right. He had saved everyone. But his rightness brought him not peace, but eternal torment. He had become a Cassandra whose prophecy had come true in the most monstrous way. He had won his long war against the elements, but he had lost everything else. Akiko was the only one who tried to move on, for Hana's sake. She found work in a hospital, washing bandages. And this routine, heavy labor, helped her keep from going insane. Hana, strangely enough, handled it better than the others. The child's psyche, protected by her mother's love, had suppressed the most terrifying memories, leaving only a vague sense of a long stay in a dark but safe cave. The war ended. Japan surrendered. Life, slowly and painfully, began to return. People cleared the rubble, built temporary barracks, but the Tanaka family could never return to a normal life. The chasm that had opened between them and the rest of the world was too deep. They were carriers of a terrible secret, not only of what they had seen, but of what they had done, or rather, not done. Kenji died a year later, quietly, in his sleep. The doctor said it was old age, but Takeshi knew he had died of grief and guilt. He was buried in a common cemetery without any special honors. His feat, his prophetic madness, remained unrecognized. Takeshi never built a new house. He sold his plot of land for next to nothing and moved with his family to the countryside, far from Hiroshima, far from the cursed place. He worked as a simple farmer for the rest of his life, never engaging in trade again. He rarely spoke, and his neighbors considered him strange and unsociable. Akiko stayed with him, his faithful shadow, until her death. She alone knew the weight he carried in his heart. The story of the Tanaka family never made it into the official chronicles. It wasn't written about in newspapers or told on the radio. It was too inconvenient, too personal, too terrifying in its moral ambiguity. The official history demanded heroes and victims, and they were neither. They were simply survivors. Their feat, if it could be called that, was not in fighting, but in locking a door. And that act, which saved their lives, forever separated them from the community of humanity. But the story did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend. In the ruined city, among those returning to the ashes, a rumor began to spread. It was said that in one of the most devastated districts, where not one stone was left on another, a single house had survived. Not a house, but a strange storehouse that looked like an ancient tomb. A belief circulated among the soldiers clearing the rubble that the place was cursed, that faint moans could be heard from it at night. Others, conversely, considered it sacred. They said that the old man who built the storehouse was a visionary who knew of the coming catastrophe. The story turned into an urban legend, one of many born in the fires of Hiroshima. It was told in whispers, acquiring new, fantastic details. Some said the family inside had subsisted on magic roots that grew through the floor. Others swore they had seen the spirit of the old builder still guarding his fortress home. The Kura, the shameful house, outlived its creators. It was never demolished. It was so sturdy that doing so would have required too much effort. It remained standing, solitary and silent, in the midst of the new, rebuilt city. Over time, it became a kind of unofficial monument. People came to look at it, at this architectural madness that had turned out to be the only sanity in a mad world. They looked at its thick, scarred walls, at its massive, forever locked door, and tried to imagine what those inside had endured. The house became an eternal, silent reproach. A reproach not only to the Tanaka family, but to all of humanity. It was a reminder of the terrible price one sometimes pays for being right. That the line between salvation and betrayal, between heroism and selfishness, can be as thin as a hair. And that surviving hell is sometimes easier than living with the memory of it. This story is not merely a chronicle of a miraculous escape. It is a parable about how the most impregnable fortress we build to protect ourselves from the outside world can become our most terrible prison, and that the deepest scars are not left by the enemy who attacks from without, but by the choice we make within. Write in the comments what you think of this story. In their place, could you have made the same choice? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that make us reflect on what it means to be human.